coin sits wrong in his palm, too light. The emperor stamped on its face is a stranger, and beneath the thin wash of silver, the metal shows gray. A lie his fingers can read. He stands on a broken stretch of wall above the Rhine. The wind shoves through the gaps where mortar used to hold. The granary below is half empty. The barracks leak when it rains. The eagle standard in the camp has lost its gold thread, and the gilt has worn down to brown linen. He swore an oath to that eagle. 25 years of iron and blood. But the Rome that demanded the oath has become a rumor carried by tax collectors who never arrive, and the coin it pays him with is an insult pressed into his hand. This is not the Rome of Augustus, not the Rome of Trajan. This is a corpse still twitching, and he is one of the men picking at it, waiting for the body to go cold. For 5 centuries, Rome ran a machine that built men like him. It took farmers off their fields. It took stonemasons off their scaffolds. It took merchants out of their stalls and broke them down across 25 years, until what walked out the other side was something new. A soldier, yes, but also an engineer, a surveyor, a bridge builder, a killer who knew the geometry of a kill zone. At its height, this machine kept nearly 500,000 of these men under arms. Men who could throw a timber bridge across a river between sunrise and sunset, then erase a city before the next dawn. So what happens when the state that forged the weapon falls apart? The training does not evaporate. The knowledge of how to move grain across 300 miles, how to build a siege tower from green wood, how to hold a shield wall when the man beside you is screaming, none of it leaves the skull that carries it. It stays. Locked inside the most dangerous unemployed generation the world has ever seen. A freelance army of builders and destroyers turned loose on a continent already cracking under its own weight. This is not the story of the Roman legionary fading into the mist. This is the story of what he became when the wages stopped and the eagle fell. What happens when the weapon of order becomes the engine of chaos? When the men trained to hold the frontier are the ones who break it open? The soldiers of the late empire did not just watch their world die, they wrote the next one in their own hand. They took Roman discipline, Roman engineering, Roman hunger for violence, and they hammered a new age out of the rubble. An age of warlords, an age of iron, an age they were built to rule. Tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. And if you believe these buried stories deserve to be told, take a second to subscribe and stand with us. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. It started with a lie dressed in scarlet. A recruiter would ride into a provincial town, his lorica polished to a mirror, his cloak a slash of crimson against the gray stones of the forum. Behind him came a clerk with wax tablets and a stylus, and a soldier holding the standard upright, so the gilt eagle caught the morning sun. The recruiter spoke in the slow rhythm of a man selling salvation. Glory, honor, steady silver every month. A grant of farmland after 25 years of service, enough soil to feed sons and grandsons. Tacitus, writing in his annals, recorded the older bargain. Augustus had fixed the terms back in the years before AD 14, 16 years under the standards. 4 more in the reserve, a discharge bonus of 3,000 denarii. By the time Tiberius came to the throne, the mutineers of Pannonia were already complaining that the years had stretched and the money had shrunk. The lie was old, only the script was repainted. For a boy whose hands were already cracked from his father's failing plot, a boy whose future was a short life bent over a hoe, the words landed like a hammer on an anvil. He saw the helmet shining in the sun. He did not see the skull that would one day rattle inside it. He saw the future. He did not see the contract that would own his bones. When he stepped forward and pressed his palm to the legion's standard, when his mouth shaped the words of the Sacramentum Militare, something in him died, and he did not know it yet. He swore to obey. He swore to defend the Roman people unto death. He swore not to flee the line. He swore that the safety of the state stood above the safety of his own family. He stopped being a person in that instant. He became inventory, number stamped, century assigned, state property with a heartbeat. His life now had one purpose: to be spent when the emperor needed change. The training that followed was not instruction, it was erasure. The man he had been was scoured off him like rust from iron. Vegetius, writing his De Re Militari in the late 4th century AD, set down the blueprint that had shaped legionaries for generations. 20 miles of march in 5 hours under a sun that cooked the metal on his shoulders, with 60 pounds of gear riding his back. Every day. Not sometimes, every day. The faster pace, the military step, demanded 24 miles in the same 5 hours. Vegetius warned that the man who could not keep that rhythm would be left for the wolves. At nightfall, there was no rest. There was a camp to build, a ditch to dig, 9 feet deep by Polybius's old measure, a rampart to raise from the spoil, sharpened stakes to plant in the earth around the perimeter. Every night, even if the enemy was 300 miles away, the shovel became as familiar to his hand as the sword. Josephus, who watched the legions of Vespasian at work in Judea in AD 67, wrote that their drills were bloodless battles and their battles bloody drills. He learned to cross a river in full armor without sinking. He learned to fell a forest for timber. He learned to lay a road that would still carry traffic 1,000 years after he was dust. He learned to assemble a ballista that could throw a stone the weight of a man across half a mile and turn a wall into gravel. He learned to dig a sap toward an enemy gate, while archers tried to kill him through the wicker hurdle above his head. His weapons training was not the romance the recruiter had promised. It was a science of slaughter, broken down to its smallest parts, and drilled until his arms moved without his mind. He swung a wooden sword that weighed twice what the gladius would weigh in battle. He carried a wicker shield twice as heavy as the scutum. The point was simple. When the day came that the iron was in his hand, it would feel weightless. He did not learn to fight with flourish. He learned one motion. A short, upward thrust. Into the groin. Into the soft belly under the ribs. 2 inches of steel kills a man, as well as 2 feet. And it lets you pull back fast and find the next throat. Vegetius wrote it plain. A cut wound, however deep, rarely kills. A stab 2 inches in is mortal. No wide swings, no heroics, no wasted breath. Kill, step, kill. For 25 years, this was his trade. He became something the world had never built before. A man who could lay an aqueduct on Monday and erase a village on Tuesday. A human tool with 100 edges. His loyalty was not love of country. His loyalty was muscle memory and payday. And the first crack in him did not come from a sword. It came from a coin. In the early empire, the silver denarius was a piece of the imperial promise made solid. Pure metal. Honest weight. Under Augustus, the coin ran at roughly 98% silver. A coin a soldier could send home and know it would feed his mother through winter. A coin that, multiplied over a quarter century, became a farm. Nero began the slow theft in AD 64. He shaved the weight. He cut the purity to 93%. Suetonius noted the emperor's hunger for revenue and his contempt for old standards. After Nero, the door stayed open. Trajan reached in. Marcus Aurelius reached in deeper to pay for the wars on the Danube. By the reign of Septimius Severus, the denarius was barely 50% silver. By Gallienus in the 260s AD, the so-called silver coin was a copper slug with a wash, thin enough to rub off on a wet thumb. Civil wars had bled the treasury dry. Between AD 235 and 284, the empire ate through more than 20 emperors, most of them murdered by their own troops. Corruption had eaten what was left. Emperors who could not afford the army they needed turned to the oldest fraud in the world. Picture the soldier returning from a patrol across the Danube. The forest there smells of cold pine sap and wet iron. The mist clings to the horse's flanks until midday. 2 men from his contubernium had been dragged off their horses that morning by Gothic raiders. He had heard the sounds they made. He carries those sounds home with him, lodged somewhere behind his teeth. He lines up for his stipendium outside the Principia, the headquarters tent in the center of the fort. The paymaster sits on a stool with a wax tablet on his knee, calling names. He drops a leather pouch into the soldier's palm. He opens it. The coins look like silver in the firelight. They do not feel like silver. The weight is wrong. He scrapes one against a stone, and there it is, the dull bronze gleam under the skin of the wash. The lie made visible. The bread vendor in the camp wants 3 of these coins for a loaf that cost one a year ago. The wine has been cut with water, and the leather to fix his boots costs more than a week's pay. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, posted on stone in AD 301, tried to freeze the bleeding with the threat of death for overcharging. It failed within a year. The merchants vanished. The black markets opened. Nothing went home. Nothing was saved. He bled for a treasury that was robbing him in the same breath. This was not one bad year. It was a slow rot that crawled through the legions, fort by fort, season by season. Loyalty is not free. It has a price. When the price stopped being paid in real silver, the loyalty started corroding too. Then came the second betrayal, and this one cut deeper than the coin. He looked at the centurion barking orders at him. The man whose vinstick, the vitis, could shatter a forearm and leave a man pissing blood for a week. The Latin coming out of that mouth was thick now, shaped by a different tongue. Gothic vowels. Frankish consonants. The accent of the very peoples he had spent his youth being trained to kill. He looked higher up the chain. The Magister Militum, the supreme commander of the Western armies under the boy Emperor Honorius, was a Vandal. His name was Stilicho. His father had served Valens as a cavalry officer. He had married Serena, the niece of Theodosius the Great. He held the West together with one hand for over a decade. The man standing shoulder to shoulder with our soldier in the shield wall was an Alan. The cavalry sweeping the flank were Sarmatians from beyond the Black Sea. The barbarians were no longer across the river. They were his officers, his comrades, his superiors. The legions, hollowed out by the Antonine Plague in the 160s AD, then again by the plague of Cyprian after AD 249, and gutted further by the slow demographic collapse of the western provinces, had thrown their gates open to anyone who could swing a sword. Germanic warriors. Steppe horsemen. Hunnic auxiliaries hired by the wagon load after AD 380. Anyone with a working arm and a willingness to take Roman pay. The word Roman began to dissolve in his mouth. It used to mean blood. It used to mean a city, a language, a senate, 1,000 years of ancestors buried beneath the same roads. Caracalla's edict of AD 212, the Constitutio Antoniniana, had already cracked the meaning open by handing citizenship to every free man in the empire. Now, it meant a uniform, a job, a paycheck that could not be cashed. The old citizen soldier from Hispania or Gaul looked at these new men with a mix of fear and contempt. They fought hard. He respected the way they killed, but they did not fight for Rome. They fought for the man who led them. Loyalty had stopped being a thing owed to an institution. It was personal now. It belonged to the general who learned your name, who fed you, who promised you a fat share of the next town's silver. Consider Arbogast, a Frank by blood. He rose through the Western army in the 380s AD and ended up the real power behind the throne of the puppet emperor Eugenius. When Theodosius killed him at the Battle of the Frigidus in AD 394, the lesson was not lost on the next generation of barbarian officers. Power flowed not from Rome, but from the men with swords in their hands. Stilicho learned it. Alaric learned it. Ricimer would learn it. Odoacer would learn it last. The army was breaking into pieces from the inside out. Each piece pledged to a different strong man. And the soldier on the cold frontier found himself with a question he could not say aloud. Did he owe his life to a faceless emperor in a marble palace 1,000 miles away? An emperor whose coin was a fake? Or did he owe it to the Gothic warlord who fought beside him in the mud, who paid him in real gold solidi struck from Constantinople's mint? Who could keep him alive through the next winter? The answer was not a betrayal. It was arithmetic. Rome, the idea was dying in the imperial documents. Rome, the war band, was being born in the camps. Then came the final insult, the policy of foederati. It had been the desperate fix of Theodosius after the catastrophe at Adrianople in AD 378, where the Emperor Valens had been killed and 2/3 of the eastern army had been butchered by the Goths in a single afternoon. Ammianus Marcellinus, the last great historian of Rome, wrote that nothing comparable to the slaughter had been seen since the disaster of Cannae. The empire could not replace those men, so it hired the men who had killed them. To the politicians in Ravenna and Constantinople, it looked like a brilliant solution. Why bother training Romans when you could hire whole nations to fight for you? Settle the Visigoths inside the borders after the Treaty of AD 382. Feed them, arm them, give them land in Moesia and Thrace. Let them defend the empire as allies bound by foedus, by treaty. To the soldier standing on a crumbling wall in Pannonia, where the wind off the Danube cut through the cracks in the mortar, and the only sound at night was the cough of the sentries, it was the final knife. He watched as the Goths received the farmland he had been promised for his retirement. He watched the imperial wagons roll past his half-rations and dump grain in the camps of men he had spent his life being trained to kill. He had to keep the peace in territories that now legally belonged to his enemies. And he saw them up close. He saw what was happening. They were learning. They were watching the legions drill. They were copying the armor, the formations, the engineering, the supply systems. They were taking notes in their heads. The young Alaric himself had served as a Roman officer under Theodosius at the Frigidus, commanded Gothic auxiliaries on the Roman side, and walked away from that battlefield with everything he needed to bring the empire down. They served beside the Roman ranks long enough to map every weakness. They were not allies. They were a virus the empire had injected into its own veins with both hands. The hatred in the frontier camps thickened like blood in cold water. Every morning the soldier looked across the river at the free barbarians who might kill him by sundown. Then he turned around and looked at the privileged barbarians who had been given his land by his own emperor. He was being crushed between them, and the empire was holding the press. He was a stranger in his own legion, a ghost in a fortress that no longer remembered why it was built, a tool being used to sharpen the axe that would split the empire's neck. For those of us who walk this far into the dark with me, there is a kind of unspoken kinship. We are not here for entertainment. We are here to understand the machinery that grinds civilizations into bone meal. If that pull lives in you, if the abyss looks back and you stare harder, then I want you in our inner circle. It is called the Lineage. Members do more than support the channel. They fund the research, the long nights, the deep digs into archives most people never open. They get the investigations first, before anyone. Join the ranks, become part of the Lineage, and help us keep this fire burning. The break, when it finally came, did not arrive as thunder. It came as a tremor that started far to the south and traveled north along the roads the legions themselves had built. The setup had been laid 2 years earlier. In August AD 408, at Ravenna, the eunuch courtier Olympius had whispered into the ear of the boy Emperor Honorius until the emperor signed the death warrant of Stilicho. The general who had held the West together was beheaded at the church where he had taken sanctuary. His son Eucharius was hunted down and murdered shortly after. The wives and children of 30,000 barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army were then slaughtered in the cities where they had been quartered as hostages of good behavior. Those 30,000 men fled across the Apennines and joined Alaric. The Goths now had a Roman-trained corps large enough